In the pristine lobby of Pinnacle Bank, a black woman faces cruel prejudice. She's denied her own money, humiliated by a smug manager. But what this staff doesn't know? She owns the bank, and her justice will leave them speechless. The gleaming marble floors of Pinnacle Bank's flagship branch in Columbus, Ohio, reflected the morning sunlight streaming through towering windows, casting an air of prestige that seemed to murmur wealth and exclusivity. At 9:30 a.m., the lobby hummed with soft activity. Businessmen in crisp suits adjusted their ties, their leather shoes tapping lightly against the floor as they moved with confidence. Retirees gripped worn checkbooks with trembling hands, their faces lined with determination, and young professionals scrolled on their phones, their eyes flicking between screens and the counter, waiting for their turn at the sleek wooden stations. Tellers worked with precision, their name tags catching the fluorescent lights, handling transactions with smiles that felt forced, their voices brisk as they called out, "Next please," in a steady rhythm. Yet beneath this flawless exterior, a storm was brewing, one that would shatter the illusion of fairness Pinnacle Bank claimed to uphold, revealing the deep biases lurking within its walls, biases buried under glowing metrics, but impossible to ignore for someone determined to uncover the truth. Lydia Carter, a 42-year-old black woman, stepped through the revolving glass doors, the faint whoosh of the mechanism cutting through the steady hum of activity. Her navy hoodie and dark slacks, a stark contrast to the refined attire around her. Her face cap sat low, shadowing her keen brown eyes, the brim casting a subtle shadow over her face as she moved with confidence that belied the weight she carried. Her natural hair was pulled into a neat bun, a practical choice for a day she knew might test her patience, the strands tucked carefully beneath the cap, a small preparation for the challenge she suspected awaited her. In her hand, she carried a modest leather purse, its surface worn but cherished, a gift from her team when she'd taken over Pinnacle Bank 5 years ago, a detail no one in this busy lobby could have guessed, a symbol of her journey from a small-town dreamer to a powerhouse in finance. Lydia had transformed this bank from a struggling regional chain into a national leader, her brilliance and fierce determination carrying her through decades of adversity in a world that often refused to see her worth, a world where every step forward came with whispers of doubt rather than praise for her skill. She'd started as a teller 20 years ago, standing behind a counter like the ones before her now, her uniform crisp and her smile forced, as she endured customers who'd ask for someone more experienced, their eyes lingering on her skin rather than her name tag. But Lydia had pressed on, her father's lessons echoing in her mind. Work hard, keep your head up, and never let them falter. Her father, a janitor who'd worked double shifts to fund her college, had been her anchor, his weary smile a testament to the sacrifices he'd made for her dreams. Dreams she'd turned into reality through sheer grit, a finance degree, an MBA from Ohio State, and finally the CEO chair at Pinnacle Bank, earned through record-breaking quarters and a reputation for turning struggling branches around. Today, she wasn't here as the CEO. She'd come as an ordinary customer, her identity hidden, driven by reports of racial bias in customer service that had reached her desk, reports she needed to witness firsthand to root out the truth, to see if the bank she'd built had strayed from the values of fairness she'd fought her entire life to uphold. Settling into a chair in the waiting area, Lydia's gaze swept the room with the precision of a leader who'd spent years honing her instincts, catching every detail others might miss, her mind alert and focused. She watched a white businessman in a pinstripe suit stride to the counter, bypassing the line entirely as a teller greeted him with a warm smile, her voice bright as she escorted him to a private office, her tone all deference. "Right this way, sir." Moments later, a Latina woman in a nurse's uniform approached the same counter, her scrubs creased from a long shift, her request for a quick deposit met with a curt nod and a gesture toward the chairs, her tired eyes flashing with frustration as she was told to take a number, her shoulders slumping as she shuffled to the waiting area, her sigh heavy with the weight of dismissal. Disparity was subtle, but glaring, a reminder of the countless times Lydia herself had been overlooked in her own career, times when she'd walked into boardrooms only to be mistaken for an assistant, her expertise questioned despite her credentials, the doubts rooted not in her work, but in the color of her skin. As Lydia waited, the lobby's atmosphere grew tense, the subtle biases becoming more apparent in the way customers reacted to her presence. A young white couple nearby glanced at her, their whispers sharp, as the woman muttered, "She's been waiting a while. Probably doesn't have an appointment." Her tone laced with assumption, her partner nodding as if Lydia's hoodie alone explained her delay, their judgment a faint echo of the systemic biases Lydia had come to test. A middle-aged black woman waiting a few seats away caught Lydia's eye, her expression a mix of resignation and understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience of being overlooked. Her hands fidgeting with a worn wallet as she waited for her own turn, her presence a reminder that Lydia's fight wasn't just for herself, but for everyone who'd felt invisible in spaces like this. The unfairness of it all settled in Lydia's chest like a stone, a familiar pang of frustration that had followed her from her childhood in a small Ohio town, where she'd watched her father come home exhausted after cleaning offices, his spirit unbroken, as he'd told her, "You're going to change things." After 25 minutes of waiting, despite the lobby being only half full and 3 white customers who'd arrived after her already served, their transactions handled with smiles, while she sat unnoticed, Lydia stood and approached the counter, her withdrawal slip and ID in hand, her heart steady but heavy, with the weight of what she suspected would come. The teller, a young man named Ethan, with a forced smile, glanced at her, his expression shifting from courtesy to skepticism as he took in her casual attire, his gaze lingering on her hoodie as if it marked her as out of place. "I'd like to withdraw $120,000. 0 cents, Lydia said, her voice calm and measured, sliding her documents across the counter with confidence that belied the storm inside her, a storm of memories, of being doubted, dismissed, that threatened to rise. Ethan's eyes widened, his fingers freezing over the keyboard as he looked her up and down, doubt crossing his face like a shadow, his brow furrowing as if her request were unthinkable. "That's a large amount," he said, his tone edged with suspicion, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of the teller next to him, who glanced over with a raised eyebrow, her lips twitching into a smirk. "I'll need to get my manager." Lydia nodded, her composure steady, but inside, the sting of his judgment seared like an old scar reopening, a pain that echoed every time she'd been made to feel less than in the bank she'd built. A bank meant to stand for fairness but already failing her test. Ethan's hurried steps faded as he disappeared into a back office, leaving Lydia standing alone at the counter, the weight of curious stares from other customers pressing down on her, their eyes boring into her with a mix of curiosity and judgment that made her skin prickle. A middle-aged white woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her companion, her voice a harsh whisper that cut through the hum of the lobby. "She doesn't look like she has that kind of money." Each word a blade that pierced Lydia's chest, a raw reminder of the biases she'd spent her life fighting, biases that had followed her from childhood playgrounds to corporate boardrooms. The woman's companion nodded, her lips pursing as she adjusted her designer handbag, her gaze flicking toward Lydia with disdain that felt like a shove, a silent message that Lydia didn't belong in this space, that she was an outsider daring to step into a world not meant for her. Lydia kept her gaze steady, her hands clasped tightly around her purse, the leather creaking under her grip, but the shame burned, a searing pain that brought back memories of her father's weary eyes after long shifts, his voice echoing in her mind. "Never let them see you break, Lydia." Her father had spent his life cleaning floors in buildings like this one, his hands rough but his heart tender, always finding time to help her with math homework despite his exhaustion, his pride in her a light that had guided her through every challenge. He'd died just 2 years before she'd taken over Pinnacle Bank. His last words, a whispered promise. "You're going to make things better, Lydia. For everyone." That promise had driven her to this moment, to this lobby where she stood now, facing the same prejudices he'd faced, the same prejudices she'd vowed to eradicate when she'd become CEO, Her acceptance speech a vow: Pinnacle Bank will treat every customer with respect. No exceptions. Now, standing at the counter, those words felt hollow, a bitter irony as she faced the discrimination she'd sworn to eliminate, the sting of it sharper because it came from the institution she'd poured her heart into building. The branch manager, Claire Donovan, emerged from the back office, her navy blazer crisp and her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that mirrored the unyielding steel of her demeanor, her posture radiating arrogance. At 38, Claire had built a reputation for efficiency. Her branch boasted record-high transaction volumes, earning her praise from corporate. But beneath her composed exterior lay a deep pressure that had shaped her into the woman who stood before Lydia now. Corporate demanded perfection, higher profits, fewer complaints, a flawless image that left no room for error. That pressure had hardened her, made her quick to judge anyone who didn't fit the mold of the ideal customer. A mold shaped by her own biases and corporate's unspoken expectations, rewarding conformity over fairness. She'd learned to prioritize numbers over people, to see customers like Lydia as risks rather than individuals, a mindset that had kept her branch at the top but had buried the values she'd once held dear. Claire's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step a declaration of her authority as she approached, her smile a thin veneer that didn't reach her cold blue eyes, eyes that scanned Lydia with disdain that felt like a weight. I understand there's an issue with a withdrawal. Faged kayet, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, her gaze raking over Lydia's hoodie with a slight curl of her lips, as if the sight of her was an affront to the pristine image of Pinnacle Bank, an image Claire had fought to maintain under corporate's watchful eyes. $120,000, 0 cents is a significant amount. May I ask what it's for? The question hung in the air like a challenge, one that hadn't been posed to the white businessman who'd withdrawn a similar sum just minutes earlier, his transaction handled with ease, his purpose unquestioned, as he'd left with a firm handshake, a courtesy Lydia knew she'd never receive. Claire's question was a test, a way to assert her dominance, to remind Lydia of her place, a place Claire believed was beneath the counters of Pinnacle Bank, defined not by her account balance, but by the color of her skin. Lydia met Claire's gaze, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her, a tempest of anger and hurt she'd learned to control through years of facing such disrespect, years of proving herself in rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. It's for a business investment, she said, her tone calm but firm, her fingers tightening around her ID as she slid it across the counter again. The small act a defiance against the judgment in Claire's eyes, a defiance born of a lifetime of standing tall against those who'd tried to make her feel small. Claire's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing as she picked up the ID, holding it between her fingers as if it were distasteful. Her posture radiating scorn, her fingers lingering on the edges of the card as if reluctant to touch it fully. We've been seeing unusual activity with accounts like yours, she said, her voice low but pointed, emphasizing like yours, with a tone that made the nearby tellers exchange knowing glances, their smirks barely concealed, their eyes flicking toward Lydia with contempt that made her stomach churn. The words struck Lydia like a blow, the implication clear. Her race, her appearance, made her a suspect in the bank she owned, a betrayal that cut deeper than any personal slight, a betrayal of the values she'd fought for in boardrooms where she'd been the only black face, where she'd had to work harder just to be heard. A young black man in a delivery uniform at the next counter caught Lydia's eye, his resigned expression a mirror of her own frustration, a silent acknowledgement of the shared struggle they both knew too well, a struggle that had followed them into spaces meant to be equal. He'd been waiting longer than Lydia, his simple request to deposit a paycheck met with extra scrutiny, his hands tightening around his clipboard as he watched the scene unfold, his jaw set in a way that spoke of a lifetime of such moments, moments that had fueled Lydia's rise but now threatened to tear down everything she'd built. Yet amidst the rising tension, a small act of kindness offered a flicker of hope that eased the pain in Lydia's heart. a reminder of why she'd taken on this fight. A junior teller named Maya, a soft-spoken woman with warm brown eyes and a name tag that read trainee, had been watching the exchange from the sidelines, her hands fidgeting with a stack of deposit slips, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus on her work. Maya had joined Pinnacle Bank just 3 months ago, her own experiences with bias as a young Latina woman fueling an empathy for Lydia, a connection born of shared pain, of knowing what it felt like to be judged before speaking. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where her parents had struggled to get loans, where her brother had been denied a small business account despite a solid plan, all because of assumptions about their last name. Assumptions that had left scars Maya carried with her. Scars that now stirred as she watched Lydia face the same treatment. Maya stepped closer to her colleague, a young man named Daniel who'd been at the bank for a year, her voice barely above a whisper, her words trembling with unease. "This doesn't feel right," she said, her eyes darting between Lydia and Claire, her discomfort a small but powerful sign that not everyone in the branch shared Claire's prejudice, that there were still those who saw the injustice unfolding. Daniel shrugged, his expression neutral, but Maya's words lingered in the air, a subtle rebellion against the status quo, a rebellion that Lydia caught in the corner of her eye, her gaze meeting Maya's for a brief moment, a connection that eased the sting of her shame, a glimmer of hope that change might still be possible, even as Claire's voice grew colder. Her words of public condemnation that echoed through the lobby. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve people like you here." Claire's words sliced through the lobby like a gunshot, the blatant prejudice tearing away any pretense of professionalism, leaving Lydia exposed to the burden of every customer's stare, their gazes a mix of judgment and curiosity that pressed down on her, a scrutiny she'd faced too many times, but never in the bank she'd built. A businessman in a gray suit muttered to his companion, his voice carrying just enough to reach her ears, "She's probably trying to scam them." The accusation, drawing a smirk from Ethan, who'd returned to his station, his arms crossed with a smug satisfaction that made Lydia's stomach churn. A bitter reminder of the assumptions she'd fought her entire career. But the elderly black man in the delivery uniform shook his head, his hands tightening around his clipboard as he whispered to himself, "This isn't right." His soft dissent a small crack in the barrier of judgment surrounding her, a faint echo of the fairness she'd promised to uphold when she'd taken over Pinnacle Bank, a promise now being tested in the most painful way. The air grew thick with unease, the hum of the cash-counting machines a cruel mockery of the fairness Pinnacle Bank claimed to uphold, its mission statement, serving all with respect, taunting her from the wall above, a hollow promise in the face of Claire's disdain. Claire leaned forward, her voice dropping to a stage whisper meant for everyone to hear, her words dripping with malice. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a check-cashing place down the street," her fingers tapping the counter as if dismissing a child, her tone laced with a scorn that stung deeper than any insult Lydia had faced in years, a calculated blow designed to strip her of her dignity. "They're better equipped for your needs." The pause before needs was deliberate, a sneer woven into the word, and the lobby seemed to hold its breath, the force of her disdain hanging in the air like a dark cloud ready to burst. Lydia felt the rage bubbling beneath her calm exterior, a fire she'd learned to control through decades of facing such disrespect. Its heat searing through her chest as she stood there, the target of Claire's venom. But she held her ground, her posture steady, her father's lessons anchoring her like a lifeline. Dignity isn't given, it's earned. She reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with a subtle defiance that made Claire's smirk falter for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face as she sensed a change in the air, a premonition of the reckoning that was about to unfold. The customers around her began to react, their whispers growing louder, a chorus of judgment that added to the pressure on Lydia, a pressure she'd carried since childhood, when she'd watched her father come home exhausted from cleaning offices, his spirit unbroken, his words a mantra that had guided her. "Never let them see you break, Lydia." A young white woman in a floral dress, sitting near the entrance, leaned toward her friend, her voice a harsh whisper. "She doesn't belong here. Look at her clothes." her words a dagger that pierced Lydia's heart, a reminder of the countless times she'd been judged for her appearance. But a middle-aged Latina woman, waiting with her teenage son, met Lydia's gaze, her expression one of quiet solidarity, her own experiences with bias etched into the lines of her face, a shared understanding that spoke of the times she'd been overlooked. Her presence a reminder that Lydia's fight was for everyone who'd been denied respect. "I'd like to speak with someone who can actually help me," Lydia said, her voice steady, her stare locking onto Claire's with an intensity that made the manager flinch, the strength in her look carrying a power Claire hadn't anticipated, a power born of years of overcoming adversity. "Someone with real authority." Claire scoffed, her arms crossing tightly over her chest, her confidence returning as she leaned back, her tone icy. "I'm the highest authority here." The words a sharp snap that made Maya, the junior teller, take a step back, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron, her warm brown gaze wide with fear for Lydia. But Maya's unease was morphing into resolve, her mind flashing to her brother, who'd been denied a loan at this branch, despite a solid business plan, the memory fueling a courage that pushed her to act. She slipped away from her station, her heart pounding as she approached a senior teller named Victor, a 50-year-old veteran with a stern but kind demeanor, who'd mentored her since her first day, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of the lobby. "We need to do something," she whispered, her voice urgent, her hands gesturing toward Lydia, her expression pleading for action. Victor frowned, his attention shifting to the scene at the counter, a flicker of recognition sparking in his mind. He'd seen Lydia's face at a company event years ago, though he couldn't place her, the memory nagging at him like a puzzle he needed to solve. Victor's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around his pen as he watched Claire's malice escalate, her actions pressing against his own sense of fairness, a sense honed over decades of working in a bank that had once prided itself on equality, a value he'd seen erode under corporate pressures. He thought of his daughter, a young black woman who'd faced similar treatment, stories that had broken his heart and fueled his resolve to make a difference. "I'll make a call," he said, his voice low but firm, a decision that set the stage for a dramatic shift, his words carrying the promise of change that Maya had been desperate to hear. He slipped into the back office, dialing the head office with a sense of urgency that Maya hadn't seen in him before, his words a hushed plea that echoed with purpose. "We have a situation in the lobby," his voice steady but laced with a determination that spoke of his belief in what was right, a belief that now drove him to act. Lydia, still at the counter, felt the change in the air, a subtle shift that told her help was on the way, a flicker of hope blooming amidst the wave of shame, a hope that transformed into a steady determination as she prepared to reclaim the dignity Claire had tried to strip away, her father's voice urging her to stand tall, to fight for what was right. The hope in her chest grew stronger, a beacon in the darkness of Claire's malice, a beacon that reminded her of why she'd taken on this undercover visit, to root out the biases in her bank, to ensure Pinnacle Bank would once again be a place where every customer was treated with respect, a place where her father's sacrifices would not be in vain. The tension in the lobby reached a breaking point as Claire signaled to a security guard, a young man named Thomas, who looked visibly uncomfortable, his hands hovering near his belt as if torn between duty and conscience, his furrowed brow revealing the moral conflict within him, a conflict rooted in the values his mother had instilled in, values of fairness, of doing what was right, even when it was hard. "Escort this woman out," Claire ordered, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, her finger pointing at Lydia as if she were a trespasser, not a customer, her tone leaving no room for hesitation, a command that carried the force of her authority, an authority she wielded with a harshness that made Thomas's stomach twist. Thomas hesitated, his gaze flickering between Claire and Lydia, the disquiet in his expression a mirror of the growing unrest in the lobby. A subtle question of whether he was on the right side of this moment, a question that echoed the doubts he'd felt every time he'd seen Claire treat a customer with disdain. Doubts that now rose to the surface, demanding to be heard. Lydia stood her ground, her phone still in hand, her voice calm but unyielding, a steel beneath her words that made the air around her crackle. "I'm not leaving until I get my money." Her defiance a steady challenge that made Claire's face flush with anger, the vein in her temple throbbing visibly as she struggled to maintain control, her authority slipping through her fingers like sand, her composure fraying under the strength of Lydia's resolve. But before Thomas could act, the grand double doors of the branch burst open with a force that resounded through the marble lobby, quieting every whisper, every murmur, as all attention turned to the entrance. The sound, a thunderclap that seemed to herald a reckoning, a moment of righteousness that the lobby had been waiting for, even if they didn't know it yet. Catherine Brooks, Pinnacle Bank's head of operations, and Lydia's longtime ally, strode in, her tailored gray suit a symbol of authority that commanded immediate attention. Her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that felt like the march of righteousness itself, each step a declaration of her intent to right the wrongs unfolding before her. A mission she'd taken on the moment Victor's call had come through. "Stop this immediately," Catherine barked, her voice ringing with a power that froze everyone in place, her tablet clutched tightly in her hand as she marched toward the counter, her glare blazing with righteous fury. A force rolling in to sweep away the injustice that had taken hold in the branch Lydia had built with her own hands, a branch meant to be a beacon of fairness, but that had become a battleground for the very biases Lydia had fought against her entire life. Claire's confident facade cracked, her face paling as she recognized Catherine, a woman she'd only seen at corporate events, her unexpected arrival sending a jolt of fear through her, the kind of fear that comes when you realize you've made a catastrophic mistake, a mistake that could unravel everything you've worked for. "Ms. Brooks," Claire stammered, smoothing her hair in a nervous gesture, her earlier bravado replaced by a tremor of dread, her mind racing to find a way out of the mess she'd created, a mess that had started with her own biases she'd let fester under corporate pressures. What brings you here?" Catherine ignored her, her focus locking onto Lydia with a mix of respect and apology, her voice softening as she addressed her, the words carrying through the hushed lobby. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." A public acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. A moment of validation that made Lydia's chest tighten with a bittersweet relief. A relief that mingled with the hope she'd felt moments before. A hope that now blossomed into a quiet strength. Catherine turned to Claire, her expression hardening, her voice a blade that cut through the disquiet. "Do you have any idea who this is?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication, as Claire's mind raced, her earlier certainty giving way to panic, her hands trembling as she realized the ground beneath her was crumbling, her career slipping away in the face of Catherine's unyielding focus. Catherine didn't wait for an answer, her voice rising as she delivered the twist that changed everything. "This is Lydia Carter," she announced, her words resounding off the marble walls, "the CEO and owner of Pinnacle Bank. Your boss." The revelation landed like a bombshell, Claire staggering backward as if struck, her hands shaking, as the reality crashed down on her. The smug narrative she'd built, shattered in an instant. Her career unraveling before her. A career she'd spent years building through late nights, now reduced to rubble by her own actions. Actions she couldn't take back, no matter how much she wished she could. Ethan's jaw dropped, his hands freezing over the keyboard, while Maya's expression widened, a mix of shock and relief washing over her face, her earlier unease giving way to a soft awe at the woman she'd stood up for. A woman who'd turned out to be the very person who'd built the bank they all worked for. A woman whose strength now filled the lobby with a palpable energy. Customers gasped, their whispers turning to murmurs of disbelief. The elderly black man in the delivery uniform nodding in satisfaction, a small smile tugging at his lips as change began to unfold. His earlier dissent, now a testament to the hope he'd held on to in the face of Claire's harshness. A hope that had been rewarded in the most unexpected way. A young black couple, who'd been waiting to open an account, exchanged a glance. Their expressions filled with admiration for Lydia, their own experiences with bias at other banks making this moment all the more powerful. a moment of vindication for every time they'd been denied respect. The businessman in the gray suit who'd accused Lydia of scamming shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by a flush of embarrassment, his companion avoiding his gaze as the truth of their assumptions came to light, a truth that exposed their own biases in a way they couldn't ignore. Lydia stepped forward, her presence now commanding a respect that filled the lobby with a palpable energy, her voice steady but laced with a subtle fire, a strength that had carried her through years of adversity and now burned brighter than ever, a fire that spoke of her determination to right the wrongs she'd witnessed. "This isn't about the money," she said, her focus locking onto Claire's, the impact of her words making the manager shrink, her earlier arrogance replaced by a raw vulnerability that she couldn't hide, a vulnerability that exposed the depth of her mistake, a mistake that had cost her everything. "It's about respect, something you've failed to show, not just to me but to every customer who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who belongs here." The words hit Claire like a physical blow, her face burning with shame, the impact of her actions crashing down on her as the security footage playing on Catherine's tablet revealed the truth. A pattern of discrimination captured in crystal clear detail that would end her career in a matter of moments. A pattern that Catherine's arrival had brought to light, a pattern that Lydia had fought against her entire life. Now standing as the avenger of those who'd been wronged in the bank, she'd built to be a beacon of fairness. Lydia's words hung in the air like a gavel's strike, final and unyielding. As she stood at the center of the lobby, her presence a beacon of justice that had just shattered the illusion of Clara's authority, leaving the manager visibly shaken, her once confident demeanor replaced by a raw vulnerability that made her seem smaller, more human, but no less accountable for the pain she'd caused. Claire's hands trembled, her fingers clutching the edge of the counter as her mind replayed every moment that had led to this, every sneer, every assumption, every time she'd let her biases dictate her actions, now culminating in the loss of everything she'd worked for, her career hanging by a thread that Lydia had just severed with a single, measured sentence. Lydia turned to face her, her expression calm but resolute, a quiet power in the way she adjusted her hoodie, the same navy fabric Claire had scorned, now a symbol of her resilience, a testament to the strength that had carried her through years of adversity to this moment of reckoning. "Claire, Donovan, Ethan Reynolds," she said, addressing them by name, her voice steady, each word a final judgment that echoed with the weight of her authority. "You're terminated, effective immediately." Claire's face contorted with a mix of shock and desperation, her lips parting to protest, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to form words, but Lydia raised a hand silencing her with a single gesture, a motion that carried the authority of a leader who'd earned her place through grit and integrity, not privilege. "Your actions today, and the pattern of discrimination we've uncovered, show that you're incompatible with the values of this bank," Lydia continued, her tone measured but firm, her gaze never leaving Claire's, the intensity in her eyes a reminder of the countless times she'd been underestimated, dismissed, and now vindicated. "Pinnacle Bank exists to serve all customers with dignity, and you've failed that standard." Thomas, the security guard who'd hesitated moments before, stepped forward at Lydia's nod, his posture straightening with newfound purpose, his earlier conflict replaced by a clarity that came from witnessing justice unfold. As he escorted Claire and Ethan toward the back office to collect their belongings, their heads hung low, the burden of their disgrace a heavy mantle they couldn't shrug off. Customers watched in stunned awe, the elderly black man in the delivery uniform clapping softly, his hands weathered but steady, his expression shining with pride for the woman who'd turned humiliation into a stand for fairness. A stand that resonated with every person in the lobby who'd ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unworthy in spaces like this. Lydia turned to Maya, the junior teller who'd shown unease throughout the ordeal, her kind brown gaze now brimming with tears of relief and fear, expecting to be next in line for judgment, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron as she braced for the worst. But Lydia's expression softened, a warmth in her demeanor that made Maya's breath catch, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest as she saw the kindness in Lydia's eyes, a kindness that spoke of understanding, of shared struggle, of the belief that people could rise above their circumstances with the right support. "Maya," Lydia said quietly, her voice carrying a gentle authority that cut through the tension in the lobby. "You recognized what was happening was wrong, even if you didn't act right away. That awareness matters." Maya's expression widened, the flicker of hope blooming into cautious gratitude, a wave of relief washing over her as she realized she wasn't facing punishment but recognition, a chance to prove herself in a way she'd never imagined possible. "I'm promoting you to interim branch manager," Lydia continued, her words a lifeline that Maya clung to. "You'll have support, training, and resources, but I believe in your potential to lead with fairness." Maya nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shook Lydia's hand, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers, a gesture of solidarity that sealed her new role, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her, a determination that mirrored the resolve Lydia had shown throughout her own career, a resolve that had brought her to this moment of change. Victor, the senior teller who'd made the call to the head office, approached Lydia, his stern demeanor softening as he extended his hand, his graying hair catching the light as he offered a small, genuine smile, a rare break in his usually stoic facade. "I knew I'd seen you before," he said, his voice gruff but warm, a hint of admiration in his tone as he recalled the company event where he'd first glimpsed Lydia, a memory that had clicked into place the moment Catherine revealed her identity. "Thank you for doing what's right." Lydia shook his hand, a quiet moment of connection that spoke of the change she was determined to bring, a change that would ripple through every branch of Pinnacle Bank, a change rooted in the values her father had instilled in her. Values of fairness, of dignity, of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the terminated employees were escorted out, customers erupted in applause, their approval echoing through the lobby, a powerful affirmation of Lydia's stand, a sound that filled her with a deep sense of pride, a pride that grew from the hope she'd felt moments before, a pride in knowing she'd not only reclaimed her own dignity, but had also given a voice to those who'd been silenced by the same biases she'd faced, a voice that now rang out in the cheers of the people around her. The young black man in the delivery uniform stepped forward, his voice soft but clear, his clipboard tucked under his arm as he spoke. "You've given us all hope today." His words a testament to the impact of her actions, a hope that had turned into pride as Lydia nodded, her father's lessons ringing true in her mind. Dignity isn't given, it's earned. Lydia's stand in the lobby that day became the spark for a transformation that reshaped Pinnacle Bank from the ground up, a change driven by her unwavering commitment to fairness, a commitment that had been tested but never broken, even in the face of the deepest humiliation. Months later, she stood in the sleek boardroom of the bank's headquarters, the Columbus skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, her voice firm as she addressed her executive team, her navy suit a stark contrast to the hoodie she'd worn that fateful day, a symbol of the journey she'd taken from an underestimated customer to a leader who'd changed the course of an institution. "We're investing $60 million, 0 cents, in equity initiatives," she announced, her hands resting on the polished table, her tone resolute as she outlined her vision. "Every employee will undergo anti-bias training and our metrics will prioritize equitable service alongside profitability." The board members nodded, their initial resistance giving way to support as they reviewed the security footage, the undeniable evidence of the discrimination Lydia had faced, and the countless others who'd suffered in silence. Evidence that had convinced even the most skeptical among them that change was not just necessary but overdue, a change that Lydia had fought for with every fiber of her being, a change that now stood as a testament to her leadership. Claire, after her termination, spent weeks reflecting in her small apartment, the stillness of the space a stark contrast to the bustling lobby she'd once commanded, her days filled with a quiet introspection that forced her to confront the biases she'd let fester under the pressure of corporate demands, pressures that had turned her into someone she barely recognized. One evening she sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, the steam long since faded as she stared at her laptop, her mind replaying the incident over and over, Each memory a lesson in humility she couldn't ignore, a lesson that had stripped away the arrogance she'd once worn like armor. She typed a heartfelt email to Lydia, her fingers trembling as she wrote, the words pouring out with a sincerity she hadn't known she was capable of. I'm sorry for my actions, for the pain I caused. I've spent this time learning, and I vow to change. Lydia, seeing the authenticity in Claire's words, allowed her to return as a trainee under strict probation. A second chance that Claire seized with a determination to prove she could grow, a transformation that became a testament to the power of accountability, a power Lydia had always believed in, even when it meant extending grace to those who'd wronged her, a grace that turned her initial resolve into a deeper sense of purpose, a purpose to not just punish, but to heal, to rebuild, to create a better future for everyone. The incident sparked a broader movement, one that reached far beyond Pinnacle Bank, a movement Lydia embraced with open arms, her voice becoming a beacon for those who'd been silenced by discrimination, a beacon that shone brighter with every step she took to amplify their stories. At a press conference weeks later, she stood before a sea of cameras, her words resounding through the conference hall, her navy suit crisp, and her presence commanding as she spoke. Fairness isn't a privilege. It's a responsibility we all share. Hashtags like Fairness for All trended on social media, posts flooding in from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination, their voices a chorus of solidarity that inspired conversations about equality across the country, a chorus that grew louder with every story shared, every barrier broken. A young woman in Cleveland tweeted, her words raw and powerful, "I was denied service at a bank last year." Lydia's story gives me hope. Her post retweeted thousands of times, a ripple effect that turned Lydia's stand into a catalyst for change, a change that filled her with a profound sense of fulfillment, a fulfillment that had grown from the purpose she'd felt after Claire's redemption, a fulfillment in knowing she'd not only changed a bank, but had sparked a movement that would echo for years to come. Maya thrived in her new role as branch manager, her promotion a testament to the courage she'd shown that day, her steady strength a beacon for the staff, a reminder of what was possible when someone dared to stand up, even in the smallest way. She stood at the front of a training session, her voice steady as she shared Lydia's story with new hires, her warm brown gaze shining with pride, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. We have the power to make every customer feel valued. Her words a reminder of the lesson she'd learned, a lesson she now passed on to others, ensuring Pinnacle Bank would reflect the fairness Lydia had fought for, a fairness that had become the cornerstone of the branch's culture, a culture Maya was determined to nurture. Lydia visited the branch again months later, her casual attire now met with genuine smiles, the lobby a far cry from the tension of that day, its atmosphere warm and welcoming, a space where everyone felt seen. She glanced at a young black family opening an account, their laughter filling the air as they chatted with a teller, their ease a quiet victory in a space that had once tried to exclude her, a victory that filled her with deep fulfillment, a fulfillment that had grown from the purpose she'd felt after the press conference, a fulfillment in knowing she'd created a legacy of fairness that would endure, a legacy her father would have been proud of, a legacy that made every struggle, every sacrifice, worth it. Have you ever faced unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of justice and resilience.